The dawn of Easter Sunday in Virginia carried with it the sound of bells from a distant white church, their metal tongues calling for praise and rebirth. But down in the quarters, the only sound was coughing wet, deep and stubborn. The cabins smelled of damp wood, sweat, and bodies too tired to rest. The morning chill pressed into skin as if the air itself demanded labor. Mary rose before the horn. She always did. Her bare feet touched the dirt floor of the cabin she shared with her younger sister Dinah. Dinah's breath was shallow in her sleep. Her thin frame curled into a bundle against the cold. Mary tucked the ragged quilt higher around her hands lingering for a moment before she straightened her own shoulders. At 26, her body carried scars that spoke more truth than any sermon in the big house. She stepped outside, the earth wet from last night's rain. Across the yard, other figures moved in silence, bent, resigned, already at work. The overseer's whistle cut through the fog, sharp as a blade. Dogs barked from their kennels, eager for the chase that would come if anyone faltered. Mary bent low at the well, filling a bucket. A boy too young to lift wood without stumbling dragged the sack past her. She steadied it with one hand and whispered, "Hold it close to your chest." He nodded, eyes wide before hurrying on. It was a small act, nothing but a gesture, but in the plantation's order, kindness itself was rebellion. From the porch of the big house, Reverend Thomas Albright watched. His face was thin and pale, his black suit freshly brushed. He held a Bible in one hand and a switch in the other, as if both came from the same God. "The Lord's day is for obedience," he called down, his voice carrying through the yard. "See that no one forgets their place." The overseer Ward, broad-shouldered and red-faced, cracked his whip in the air without striking. The sound alone was enough to make spines stiffen. Mary did not look up, did not answer. She carried her bucket to the kitchen door of the big house. Shoulders straight, movements quiet. Inside, the kitchen breathed heat and smoke. Pots hissed, knives struck cutting boards, and the smell of ham and eggs filled the air. Esther, the cook, old enough to have seen 3 generations of masters, stirred a pot with swollen hand. "Get the bread started," she muttered to Mary without turning. Mary nodded, rolling up her sleeves. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm. Flour, water, salt, knead, fold, shape. But her mind was elsewhere. Every movement of her fingers recalled the warmth of another hand she once held, the deep laugh of a man who had promised her freedom in whispers beneath the magnolia tree. His name was Samuel. He had been sold last winter to cover a gambling debt of Master James Albright. 2 weeks later, word came back from Richmond. Samuel was dead, beaten to death for resisting. Mary had not wept where anyone could see. She had pressed her forehead against the cold wall of the cabin that night, biting her lip until blood filled her mouth. Dinah had tried to comfort her, but Mary had only whispered, "They took him. They cannot take what he gave me." Since that night, silence had been her armor. "Mary," Esther snapped, dragging her back into the kitchen's haze. "Mind your dough, girl." "Yes, ma'am," Mary murmured. She worked faster. The Albright family prepared for their Easter feast. The men, James, Edward, Robert, and Charles, sat in the parlor drinking brandy. Even before noon, their wives fluttered in and out, dressed in silks, laughing high and shrill. The Reverend prepared his sermon for after the meal. His notes spread across the mahogany table. 7 masters, 7 voices that had ordered lashings, sales, and lies. Mary passed through the parlor carrying trays, her eyes always low, yet she noticed everything. The way Edward favored his right leg from an old hunting injury, how Robert's face reddened quickly when he drank, how Charles tapped his fingers against the glass when impatient. She counted bottles, noted which lamps smoked more than others, where rugs overlapped near the hearth. To them she was invisible, a shadow moving between food and table. But in her silence, she carried memory. By mid-morning, the church bells rang loud. The Albrights demanded the enslaved gather outside the house to hear Reverend Thomas deliver his sermon before the feast. They stood in rows, men and women stiff, children clutching their mothers' skirts. The Reverend's voice rolled like thunder. "Slaves, Obey your masters as you obey Christ, for your reward is not of this world, but of heaven. Remember, humility is the path to grace. Mary held Dinah's hand tightly, her jaw clenched. Around her, others stared at the ground, afraid to blink too slow. She looked instead at the house itself, the tall white columns, the polished shutters, the smoke curling from the kitchen chimney. The house loomed, but she studied it not as a monument, but as something that could bleed. After the sermon, the enslaved returned to their task. The feast grew near. Guests arrived in carriages, laughter spilling into the yard. Children played on the steps of the big house, their boots scattering dust on the heads of those who bent to scrub the floor. Mary carried dishes from kitchen to dining room, her arms steady despite the work. She said little, but every step etched something deeper in her chest. She moved like water, flowing where commanded, but in her silence there was fire. And as the afternoon sun climbed high, Mary's heart beat not in sorrow, but in rhythm. Each bell, each whip crack, each command was no longer just a sound. It was a drum. The Easter feast stretched into afternoon. The long table in the Albright dining hall gleamed with crystal, brass candlesticks and silver platters heavy with lamb, ham and sweet pie. Outside the windows, spring sunlight fell across the fields, but inside the air was thick with tobacco smoke, wine and arrogance. Mary moved quietly between rooms, carrying trays, pouring drinks, lifting dishes. The men laughed loud enough to rattle glass panes. James Albright, the eldest, told stories of horse racing debts, as if ruin were a badge of honor. Edward argued politics, insisting Virginia's order must be defended no matter the cost. Robert and Charles traded jokes about the field hands, each one crueler than the last. Their wives smiled politely, their pearls shining as brightly as the knives beside their plates. Reverend Thomas presided like a king in black robes, his Bible open though he rarely glanced at it. When laughter lulled, he raised a hand to remind them all that Easter was God's covenant with the obedient. The irony tasted bitter to Mary, but she kept her face still. Dinah served at her side. At only 16, she was still clumsy, her hands trembling when she lifted a jug of cider. Robert noticed. He reached out suddenly, seizing her wrist. "Careful, girl," he drawled, pulling her closer than needed. Dinah stiffened, her eyes darting toward Mary. Mary set her own tray down, forcing her voice calm. "I'll take it, sir. She's not steady yet." Robert smirked, releasing Dinah, only to trail his fingers along the edge of her sleeve. "Teach her then. She'll serve better in time." His meaning needed no explanation. The other men chuckled, and the Reverend's lips twitched, but no rebuke came. Dinah slipped back toward the kitchen, her shoulders trembling. Mary followed soon after. In the kitchen, Esther stirred a pot of gravy with heavy arms, her face dark with no. She said nothing, only shook her head slightly. Mary guided Dinah to a stool. "Breathe," she whispered. Dinah bit her lip, fighting tears. Mary turned to the stove. She stirred, chopped, cleaned, movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. The smell of smoke lingered from the hearth. Her eyes traced the beams of the chimney, blackened with years of fire. Every board, every crack, every dry splinter of wood whispered possibilities. The afternoon pressed on. Guests grew drunker, laughter loud. Mary carried plates again and again, her silence never broken, but her eyes sharper each time she entered the hall. She counted the bottles of wine now half empty. She saw the candles burning low, their flames bending when doors opened. She noticed the way curtains brushed near the lamp. When she passed close to Reverend Thomas, he leaned toward her. "Do you pray, girl?" "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady. "And what do you pray for?" His smile was thin, his eyes pale. Mary paused just long enough to let silence cut. "That God sees The Reverend chuckled, thinking it obedience. He did not hear the iron beneath her words. By evening, the feast ended. The men staggered into the parlor, calling for more brandy. Music drifted from a piano, played poorly by Charles, who sang with slurred words. The women gossiped near the windows, their fans fluttering like wings of trapped birds. In the kitchen, the enslaved ate scraps from the feast, bones, stale bread, pieces of fat. Children gnawed quietly, their mothers keeping watch to see no one stole too much. Dinah sat close to Mary, silent still. Mary gave her the better portion of bread, then rose to fetch water. Outside the sky was dimming, clouds streaked with the last of the sun. Bells rang again from the distant church. Mary stood for a moment at the well, hands gripping the bucket handle tight. Her chest ached, not from fear but from a weight she could no longer carry. Samuel's face rose before her eyes. His laughter, the promises whispered in secret. She remembered the news of his death, the mocking words of Master James, when he told her the fool fought back. Learned his lesson in the grave. She lowered the bucket into the water, the rope creaking, her hands steady. In the silence of the yard, she whispered words no one else heard. So will you. The sound of revelry carried from the house, muffled by walk. Dogs barked somewhere far in the fields. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Mary lifted the bucket, balanced it on her hip, and walked back toward the kitchen. Every step was measured, every breath was steady. She crossed the threshold, eyes lowered, movements calm. But inside, the fire had already begun to burn. Night fell over the plantation with slow weight. The revelry in the big house did not stop. It shifted. Laughter gave way to shouting, then to drunken song. Lamps glowed behind shuttered windows, their light flickering across the yard like restless eyes. In the quarters, most had settled, bodies curled in straw and cloth, children clinging to their mothers. But Mary did not rest. She stood by the cabin door, watching the glow of the big house. Her face was still, but her hands were restless, twisting the hem of her dress, smoothing it, then gripping it again. Dinah stirred from her corner. "You're not sleeping?" Mary shook her head. "Not yet." Dinah hesitated, then whispered, "I thought maybe, after Samuel you'd give up." Mary's eyes cut to her, sharp but not cruel. Giving up is what they want, breathing when they say, crying when they allow. That ain't life. Dinah lowered her gaze. She said no more, but her breath was uneven. Mary stepped outside. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of wood smoke and spilled wine. A few lanterns swayed on the porch of the big house. She moved toward the well again, each step quiet, deliberate. She dipped the bucket, then paused, staring into the water. Her reflection trembled on the surface, scarred hands, tired eyes, but something steadier too, like stone under rushing stream. A sound broke her thoughts, laughter, rough and close. Two overseers stumbled past the yard, one carrying a lantern, the other dragging a hound by a rope. Their boots scraped the dirt. "Best check the shed," one muttered. "Last time some fool tried to hide corn." They passed without noticing. Mary's fingers tightened on the bucket handle until her knuckles ached. She waited until the dark swallowed their light, then turned back toward the cabins. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with sleeping breath. She moved quietly to a wooden chest under her coat. From beneath folded rags, she pulled a small tin box, dented but intact. Inside lay scraps she had hidden for months. Flint, a strip of cloth soaked in animal fat, a piece of charred wood, tools no one had noticed, things gathered under watchful eye. She touched them, only briefly, then closed the box and slid it back under the rags. For now, it was enough to know they were still there. The hours dragged. From the house came the crash of a bottle, the bark of a laugh, the scrape of a chair. Mary lay still on her cot, eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams black with soot. Dinah shifted in sleep, murmuring Samuel's name once, soft as a ghost. Mary's heart clenched, but she did not weep. Instead, she mouthed the words she had carried since his death, words she had spoken once at the well. "So will you." When dawn came, the air was thick with the smell of spilled ale and cold ashes. The household stirred late, groggy and sour. Mary was called to the kitchen at once, her body heavy from lack of rest, but her steps firm. Esther thrust a bowl into her hands. "For the hogs," she said. Her face looked more lined than usual, her eyes bloodshot. "Masters drank deep. They'll sleep till the sun's high." Mary carried the bowl outside, crossing the yard toward the pens. The pigs rushed forward, squealing, their snouts red with mud. She emptied the scraps, but her gaze fixed not on them, but on the main house. Its shutters hung crooked now, one curtain torn from careless hands. Empty bottles littered the porch. It looked less like a fortress this morning, more like something wounded. As she turned back toward the kitchen, she passed the wood pile. The logs were damp from dew, but beneath the top layer, the wood was dry. She touched it briefly, her fingers lingering as if greeting an old friend. Back in the kitchen, the air was restless. Dinah swept the floor, her face pale. Esther chopped onions, muttering under her breath. Mary moved between them, silent as always. But her silence was no longer the silence of survival. It was the silence of waiting. The masters began to stir near noon. Robert's voice rang first, demanding coffee. Edward cursed when he spilled it on his trousers. Reverend Thomas scolded them all for forgetting the Lord's Day, though his own head pounded with drink. Mary poured, carried, listened. Each word they spoke, each careless demand, only pressed deeper into her. When James asked for more brandy, she fetched it without flinching. When Charles laughed about lazy hands in the quarters, she placed bread before him without comment. But as she moved, she counted again, 7 men, 7 voices, 7 weights pressing down on her life, and on the lives of everyone in the quarter. She lowered her gaze, hiding the sharpness of her eyes. The fire in her chest had grown hotter. It no longer felt like grief. It felt like breath. By afternoon, the plantation moved again, with its usual cruelty. The men barked orders while servants hurried to clean the wreck of last night's feast. Empty bottles clinked into baskets. Plates were scrubbed, rugs beaten in the yard, until dust rose in choking clouds. Mary worked in the kitchen, her arms aching from the weight of iron pots. She scrubbed until her fingers reddened, but her eyes kept lifting toward the hearth. Its bricks were cracked from years of heat, its chimney dry as bone. Above it hung the heavy iron hook used to lift cauldrons, blackened with soot. She knew its every crevice. She had knelt before it countless times, feeding it wood, coaxing it to life. The hearth was the heart of the house, and Mary knew it better than anyone. The masters gathered in the study. Maps and ledgers spread across the table. Through the open doorway, Mary caught fragments of their talk about debts, about selling more slaves, about cotton prices in Richmond. Edward's voice was loudest. "We'll sell 2 boys, maybe 3. That should square the ledger." Robert laughed. "Take them from the Carter family. They breed strong." Mary's stomach turned. She bent lower over the pot, scrubbing harder, but the words sank into her like nails. She thought of Dinah, only 16, her wrists too thin, her back already bent. She thought of the children in the quarters, some barely old enough to walk, whose names were written in ledgers like cattle. That evening after the meal was cleared, the masters returned to drink again. Reverend Thomas read aloud from his Bible. In between sips of brandy, "The meek shall inherit the earth," he intoned, while James roared with laughter and slapped the table. Mary moved among them like a shadow, pouring wine, setting down plates of bread. She spoke little, never lifting her gaze, but her ears heard every word, and her mind measured each moment. The wobble of a candle, the slackness of drunken hands, the sharp scent of spilled liquor on the tablecloth. When the household finally retired for the night, the quarters grew restless. Children whimpered, mothers hushed them, men stretched sore backs on straw beds. Mary sat on her cot, staring at the wooden chest beneath it. Dinah sat beside her. "You look like stone," Dinah whispered. Mary turned slowly, her eyes steady. "Stone don't break easy." Dinah touched her arm. "Don't let them kill what's left of you." Mary covered her sister's hand with her own. They already tried. Silence hung heavy between them. Dinah finally lay down, curling small, as if the world could be shut out by closing her body. But Mary remained upright, her gaze fixed. Later that night, when the cabins were hushed and the only sound was the croak of frogs from the marsh, Mary rose. She stepped outside, the air damp, the moon hidden by clouds. She walked slowly across the yard. No one stirred. The dogs lay quiet in their pens. bellies heavy from scraps. She moved toward the woodpile again. The logs gleamed faintly in the dim light. She lifted one, feeling its weight in her hands. Dry inside, perfect for flame. She set it back down carefully, then glanced toward the main house. Its shutters were closed, its lamps dark, but to Mary's eyes it was not sleeping. It was waiting. When she returned to the cabin, she did not lie down. She sat against the wall, arms around her knees, listening to Dinah's breathing. Her eyes did not close. The next morning broke gray. Clouds pressed low, and the air smelled of rain that would not fall. The overseer's whistle cut through the yard, sharp as always. Work began again, bodies bending, hands blistering, voices hushed. Mary worked in the kitchen, her movements steady, her silence deeper than ever. Esther watched her once, long and hard, but said nothing. She had seen enough faces to know when something had hardened beyond bending. At midday, the Reverend called for a prayer gathering in the parlor. The masters assembled, their voices rough with drink, their eyes red. The enslaved were summoned too, packed into the room, standing at the edges, while the Reverend lifted his Bible. Easter is for obedience, he declared. For those who keep to their station shall find reward. For those who stray shall meet damnation. Mary stood at the back, her hands folded. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes, when they flicked toward the hearth in the corner, burned with a steadiness no sermon could quench. The prayer ended. The slaves were dismissed back to labor. The masters drank again, filling the house with noise. Mary returned to the kitchen, her silence as constant as her shadow. And as the afternoon waned, she stood before the hearth once more, staring into its dark mouth. The ashes inside whispered like a memory, faint but unyielding. She reached for the poker, stirred the embers, and felt the breath of heat still alive beneath the gray. Her lips barely moved as she spoke words no one else heard. Not yet, but soon. The 5th day of Easter week dawned with heavy air. Mist clung low across the fields, swallowing the voices of the enslaved. As they moved toward the rows, Mary stood at the well before sunrise, filling her bucket. The water trembled against the rim, as if echoing the tension in her chest. Dinah joined her, eyes hollow with exhaustion. I dreamed of Samuel, she whispered. Mary set the bucket down. Dreams don't bring him back, but they bring me hope. Dinah's voice cracked. Maybe he's free now beyond all this. Mary touched her sister's arm, not gently but firmly. Don't hope for heaven when we still got hell here. The overseer's whistle split the air. Dinah flinched and hurried off toward the fields. Mary lifted the bucket and carried it toward the kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with heat. Esther stirred a pot of grits, muttering curses under her breath. She had lived long enough to know the taste of every cruelty, but even she glanced at Mary differently now, watching, wary, as if sensing the storm gathering behind her silence. The morning passed in repetition, chopping, stirring, carrying. The masters shouted for coffee, for food, for clean clothes. James demanded his boots polished. Edward cursed about accounts in Richmond. Robert laughed at a joke only he found funny, while Charles threw dice in the study. Reverend Thomas sat in the parlor, Bible open, eyes sharp. By midday, the mood shifted. Edward stormed from the study, slamming the door. The cotton buyers are bleeding us dry, he barked. We'll have to sell more hands. Then sell them, James replied lazily from his chair. Plenty to spare. Mary froze where she stood in the hall, tray balanced in her hands. She dared not move, dared not breathe, but their words pierced deep. Sell more hands, always more. Families torn, names erased, children vanished before their mother's eyes. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat. Discipline must be maintained. God grants dominion to those who enforce order. James lifted his glass. To dominion then, they drank. Mary turned away, her steps soundless. She returned to the kitchen and set the tray down too hard, the cups rattling. Esther looked at her long, then said low, "Keep your face." Mary did, but her chest burned. That night, the quarters were restless. Whispers passed like smoke. Who might be sold? whose children would be taken. Fear choked the air. Dinah clung to Mary, her eyes wide. "They can't take me. I won't go." Mary held her close, her voice low and steady. "They won't." Dinah trembled. "How can you know?" Mary's silence was answer enough. When the yard grew quiet and the stars faded behind clouds, Mary slipped outside. She walked slowly across the damp earth until she stood before the big house. Its tall windows glowed faintly with candlelight. The walls loomed pale, proud, like bones in the dark. She stared at it a long time, every scar on her body whispering the truth of what had been done within those walls. Samuel's laughter echoed in her memory, cut short by chains. Dinah's tears clung to her sleeve. The cries of children lost to ledgers rang in her ears. Her breath deepened, steady, her fists closed tight at her sides. The night was quiet, but inside her chest was thunder. When she returned to the cabin, she did not lie down. She sat against the wall, her eyes fixed forward, unblinking. Dinah shifted in sleep beside her, but Mary's body was still as stone. At dawn, the house stirred again. Dogs barked. The overseer shouted. Work began, but something had shifted. Mary moved through the kitchen with the same quiet grace as always. Yet her silence no longer felt like submission. It felt like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. When she stood before the hearth, she reached for the poker, stirred the coals, and felt heat rise against her face. The fire breathed, hungry. She fed it, wood, watched it catch, and whispered under her breath, so soft none could hear. Soon, the Easter sky was pale, streaked with thin clouds. When the Albright masters gathered once more, the house was alive with noise, boots on the floorboards, glasses clinking, voices raised. They had drunk since morning, celebrating nothing more than themselves. Mary moved among them with the same silence she had worn all her life. She poured, she carried, she obeyed. To them she was nothing but hands and feet. To herself she was stone and fire. Dinah worked too, her steps nervous, her eyes darting. She brushed past Mary once, whispering, "Don't." But Mary's face gave nothing away. The hearth blazed hot that day. Logs cracked, sparks leapt. The chimney breathed smoke into the sky. Mary tended it carefully, feeding it more wood than usual. No one noticed. The masters were too drunk, the reverend too full of his own voice. In the parlor, James demanded more brandy. Robert sang half a hymn, turning sacred words into mockery. Edward spilled wine across the table and cursed. Charles threw dice, shouting when they rolled against him. Reverend Thomas preached about order, his hand resting on the Bible like a weapon. Mary moved between them, setting down plates, lifting empty cups, pouring again. Her eyes never rose, but her ears caught everything: their laughter, their cruelty, their careless words about lives bought and sold. When she returned to the kitchen, her chest was steady. She stood before the hearth, staring into its red heart. The flames licked higher, greedy, alive. She lifted a lamp, tilted it, and let oil spill down onto the wood. The fire hissed, flared brighter. Esther glanced at her, eyes narrowing. She said nothing, only turned back to her pot. Her silence was not ignorance, it was understanding. Mary carried dishes into the hall again. The air was thick with smoke from cigars, from the hearth, from spilled drink. The masters barely noticed. They laughed louder, raised their glasses, mocked the world beyond their walls. Dinah caught Mary's sleeve once more, whispering desperately, "Sister, please." Mary only squeezed her hand, firm, final. Then she returned to the kitchen. She lifted the poker, stirred the coals, fed the flames with more wood, more oil. The fire roared, no longer tame. Heat pressed against her face, but she did not flinch. She watched the blaze climb higher, brighter, stronger, until the hearth seemed too small to hold it. In the parlor, the men shouted over one another, drunk with wine and power. None of them saw the first tendril of smoke curling along the ceiling. None of them heard the deeper roar beneath their laughter. Mary stood straight, her eyes fixed on the flames. Her voice was low, steady, carried only to herself. "This is Samuel's breath. This is our justice." The fire leapt, cracking loud enough to turn heads. Someone shouted. Chairs scraped, glass shattered. But by then the blaze was free, climbing curtains, swallowing beams, racing through the house as if it had waited all its life for this moment. Screams tore the air, boots pounded, doors slammed, voices cried for water, for escape. The house shook with chaos. In the kitchen, Mary did not run. She stood before the hearth, her body still, her eyes bright with the reflection of the flames. Dinah clutched her arm, begging, pulling, but Mary did not move. The fire raged louder, swallowing the laughter, silencing the voices that had ruled for too long. Smoke thickened, flames roared. The big house groaned under its own weight. When the roof cracked and the windows burst, the night lit brighter than day. 7 voices were gone, drowned in the blaze. And in the yard, as enslaved men and women gathered, their eyes wide, their breaths caught, they saw her, Mary standing tall before the inferno, her face calm, her body unshaken. She did not flee, she did not beg. She watched as the fire consumed the masters, the house, the lot. And when the constables came at dawn, when the ashes still smoked and the air reeked of ruin, they found her waiting, her wrists bound easily, but her gaze unbroken. She said nothing. She did not need to. The fire had already spoken.